What's it like to live in a hearing world when you don't hear the same as everyone else? I'm not talking about personal choice or marching to the beat of your own drum. I'm talking about having a physical restriction that leads you to hear less than other people and to hear less accurately than other people. When I was about 13 years old, after many years of visits to the ear, nose, and throat doctor and trying various things, they finally discovered I had a benign tumor in my left ear. Now, this was way back in the 60s, and in order to deal with this, they had to remove it. Otherwise, it could eventually get into my brain. I had to undergo this operation, and so they removed most of the inside of my ear, making me profoundly deaf in that ear. So, from a very early age, I had to learn to rely on my one good ear. And a lot of times I didn't really understand how that affected me. It certainly added to my shyness, because when you can't hear what other people are saying to you, no matter how hard you try, it's embarrassing. And if you repeatedly ask them to speak up or say it again, they get frustrated with you, irritated with you. And so you find yourself either just pretending that you did hear it to avoid that confrontation, that embarrassment, that shame, or they get frustrated enough to say, oh, forget it. And so you've missed out on that connection. And that circumstance has been with me my whole life. And yes, I eventually did get a hearing aid for my one good ear that would help me to hear a little better. Even with the hearing aids, we cannot hear the same as a hearing person. A prime example of what we don't understand is my older sister, who had far worse hearing issues than I did, and in her teens got her first hearing aids. And I remember I was only about 11 or 12, and she looked at me and she said, I had no idea there were birds singing in the trees. Imagine that. Something that most of us just take for granted. She had never heard in her whole life. I am a one-eared composer, singer, songwriter. I have composed, mixed, and produced music that has been on television shows. How did I do that with one ear? Well, I had to try to get that to be visual. So what I did was I created panning charts for each instrument. And thinking about the timbre of each instrument, I would use my chart to balance. Okay, this is more of a bass sound, I'll put it on the left. This is also a bit of a bass sound, I'll put it on the right. And I really tried to visually see how the sound would be balanced. And then I would run off several mono versions of the composition. So this is one of the ways that I learned to live with this challenge. But the area that was and is a challenge for me is relations with other people. After my operation, I went back to school, and the knowledge that I couldn't hear very well wasn't really in the forefront of my mind, but I know that when I couldn't hear things adequately, I didn't speak up. I didn't say anything. I felt that there was something flawed in me. I felt embarrassed and ashamed. So rather than speak up and say, I need help with this, I need you to look at me when you're talking to me. I need you to not talk from behind me or from another room. I need you to visibly be present and not cover your lips so that I can see that you're talking to me. So I've had many situations because of how we speak to each other where I didn't really understand what was coming at me. And I know that when you're dealing with someone who is hard of hearing, it can get very frustrating. And you recognize when they say, in this sort of passive way that signals to you that they didn't really hear you, but they're agreeing. And that's probably irritating. But you know why we do that? Because we've tried to understand. And I think one of the misconceptions about hearing is that you must be able to hear the same level as I do, and that everything is at the same volume, and it's not. We have an inflectional language, and we tend to go up and down in our speech. So people will say, so how are things going for you? You know, I went downtown. And you miss the end part of it. Or someone speaking a longer section will rise and fall very naturally in their inflection. And guess what? You don't hear those lower tones. And my brain then works very, very hard to take the context of what's being said and try to figure out, puzzle out what the missing words might be. Which sounds really great, right? What a great talent to have. But the problem with it is that, first of all, it's mentally very exhausting. And I find when I'm conversing with someone who's particularly difficult to hear, I get very fatigued, particularly if they're on my deaf side and I have to keep turning to try to hear what they're saying. And they're not looking at me. They're on my deaf side and they're looking ahead or even sometimes looking around. And so the volume of their voice changes and I can't see their lips, which would help me. So there's been situations where I was in a conversation with someone and they were rising and falling and my brain was trying to figure out the missing words and I was replying based on what I thought they were talking about and they were replying based on what they were talking about, and it turned out after 5 minutes we were talking about totally different things, and that's happened to me more than once. So I think the thing that I'm saying is I know it's difficult. I know it's difficult to be around someone who can't hear you, particularly if they are not willing to admit that they can't hear well. It's not like they know, right? Like my sister didn't realize that there were birds singing in the trees. Someone who is losing their hearing doesn't know what they're missing. So what is needed in that case is a gentle and loving approach to sit down and say, you don't realize that when the children are talking to you, you're missing most of what they're saying. And they go away not understanding why not. Or whatever it is, right? Understand that they're probably embarrassed and shy about it. And also recognize that it's not an easy situation to deal with. I only have one hearing aid. And we had to get it on a payment plan. And I shudder for the day when it stops working and I have to go back and dig up a few thousand more. My older sister, who has top-of-the-line hearing aids that cost $3,000 or $4,000 each, and she needs 2 of them, even when wearing those hearing aids, cannot hear anymore. And they've adjusted them to the point where she's now considered profoundly deaf enough to be disabled by it. But I know one of the things, because I have dealt with my older sister, and my father also had hearing issues from operating or being near the anti-aircraft guns on the aircraft carrier during World War II. And I know he found it extremely difficult and frustrating to go to social situations or even be in a restaurant and try to converse with the waiter and ask for what he wanted or ask his questions and feel like he couldn't hear what was coming back at him. And this situation leads us to disconnect from the world. And that's really not a good thing. Not only for social connection and to avoid loneliness, but also because it will lead to cognitive decline. If we are not engaging with the world effectively, our brain will actually stop working. So one of the things that was recommended to me when I got my hearing aid was to not just hear something, but to, in the moment, hear it and then identify it. Like do the work to listen, to hear, and identify the sound. And by doing that, retraining the brain, because I think what happens when we don't hear very well is that our reactions to sound become kind of sort of whooshy. You know, it's like when you need glasses, you take off your glasses and everything's a little fuzzy. And so the brain gets lazy. It's really important that we're listening the best we can, with the hearing that we have. And it's important that the people around us understand what they need to do to assist us to hear better. Now, there's nothing more frustrating than somebody who refuses to get hearing aids, and so you have to shout at them all the time. It's not fair. And it's even more frustrating once they have the hearing aids and they say, oh, I'm not going to wear them at home. If you have hearing aids and you're not wearing them at home where your wife and your children are trying to communicate with you, you better change that up. It's very, very important that you wear your hearing aids every day, that you identify the sounds around you, that you work to redevelop your listening skills and hear the people around you. That being said, for those people on the other side, recognize that if someone has a hearing problem, they need to see you in order to hear you. Don't talk to them from behind. If you talk to me from behind, I may not even know that you're there. And I used to be called a stuck-up person because I didn't respond to people. Even when I told people I was hard of hearing. Still, that's how they responded. So I can't hear you if you're behind me. If I do hear you when you're behind me, I don't know which way to look. I don't know if you're on my right side or my left side. Because for me personally, I only have one-sided hearing. So I don't know. And I can't tell you the amount of times somebody said something to me from behind me and I turned to look and I was looking the wrong way. The other thing is, don't cover your mouth, please. When people do this and they're talking to you and you can't hear what they're saying, you're not helping. Don't turn away. Be engaged, be energetic, be there. So it kind of goes both ways, right? The person that is struggling with a loss of hearing, hopefully who at least acknowledges that, has a responsibility to work to hear as best they can and tell other people that they need help with this. And the person who is trying to communicate with someone who has a hearing problem has a responsibility to stop and say, wait a second, this person has a challenge. I shouldn't be getting irritated with them. So if you're talking to me and I don't hear you very well and I say, could you repeat that? What's really helpful is if you slow down, look at me, speak clearly so I can see what you're saying. And if I still can't hear it, then change how you're saying it, because something about the inflection that you're using or how you pronounce the words is making it more difficult for me to understand you. Now, lastly, I'd like to talk about AI. What if we use that for the issues of hearing? If I'm able to say, GPT, I can't understand what this person is saying to me. Could you help me, please? And maybe I can have a Bluetooth headphone on. Because the trouble with the hearing aids is, yes, they're great technology to a certain point, but they don't have any intuitive. You can't say to them, you know what, I hear the first 3 words of that sentence, then everything else is just a mumble to me. So I think with the advent of AI, perhaps we can get some help with this. If we can get people to the moon, if we can be sending satellites to Mars and talking about sending people to Mars, why is it that we cannot develop a hearing aid that doesn't cost thousands of dollars? Because one of the issues is that people simply cannot afford to get an aid when they need it. And because of that, we're putting them at risk. Not only do they feel lonely, do they feel shy and ashamed, but the situation may lead to their brain being less active. And that's something that none of us should ever want. That's what I have to say today. I hope it makes sense. I'd be happy to answer any questions, to have a discussion in the comments. I think this is a far more widespread problem than perhaps we're willing to admit. And in looking at other videos in this niche, I haven't seen anyone else talking about it. And yet for me, it's a very prominent thing that affects my life a great deal. I will finish with a little story. For a while there, I had a job. I worked for a company that provided courses for older people. I think it was like an elder something, right? So people would come into the city and they would check into a hotel and then they would be taken on tours and given courses. And it was very interesting work, working out the calendar and who would give a talk on this or that, what tours would be done, and things like that. But I was asked to go to the hotel on the night that the parties were coming in, and I would have to hand them out their name tag. So their name tags would be sitting on the table, and they would come up and give me their name, and then I would look for their name tag and pass them that and the little welcome package. Well, guess what happened? They would come up to the table and they'd be looking down and they'd be saying their name, and I couldn't hear it. So I quit the job after that, because that was a requirement of the job, and I wasn't wise enough to go to my employer and say, you know what, that's a really difficult situation for me. Is there a way around it?